The sound of the cleaning rod sliding through the rifle barrel echoed faintly in the quiet room. The veteran sat at a sturdy wooden table, his back to the cracked window, where cold wind seeped through the gaps. The faint buzz of static from the old radio was the only other noise, a reminder of how far removed he was from the rest of the world. It was just another day at the outpost, or so he thought. He adjusted the rifle, his hands moving with practiced ease. Each stroke of the cloth was deliberate, each part inspected and polished to precision. The weapon wasn't just a tool for him. It was an extension of his body, something he relied on more than anything else in the desolate isolation of this post. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the door slightly. He paused for a moment, listening, before shaking his head and returning to his task. Over the years, he had learned not to jump at every sound. Most noises had simple explanations: branches breaking, animals moving, or the wind itself. He was alone out here, after all. That was the deal. As he wiped the rifle's barrel, his focus narrowed. It was almost like meditation for him, until something broke the silence. A voice. "That won't save you." It was low, raspy, and unnatural. His hand froze mid-wipe. He blinked, unsure if he'd actually heard it. Slowly, he looked over at his shoulder. The room was empty, just as it had been all day. The dim light from the single bulb overhead cast soft shadows, but there was nothing out of place. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. The air felt heavier, colder somehow. He put the rifle down carefully and rose from the chair, his boots scuffing softly against the wooden floor. His eyes darted to every corner of the room, scanning for anything unusual. "Hello," he called out, his voice steady despite the unease clawing at his chest. Nothing. He stepped toward the window, the cold breeze hitting his face as he peered outside. The endless expanse of snow stretched out before him, unbroken except for the dark outline of the tree line far in the distance. No movement, no footprints, just the wind kicking up swirls of frost. "Maybe I'm hearing things," he muttered to himself, though the explanation didn't sit well with him. Years in the field had taught him to trust his instincts, and right now, every nerve in his body was on edge. Returning to the table, he picked up the rifle again, this time checking the chamber and loading a round. The metallic click of the bolt sliding into place felt reassuring. He slung the rifle over his shoulder and grabbed his sidearm from the holster on the wall. If someone or something was out there, he wasn't going to take chances. The outpost was small, consisting of just the main room, a supply closet, and a tiny sleeping area. He methodically checked each space, clearing corners and shadows with the barrel of his gun leading the way. Everything was as it should be. The only sound was the faint crunch of his boots on the floorboards. Still, the feeling of being watched refused to leave him. He glanced at the radio, its static still humming quietly. He reached over and twisted the knob, trying to raise anyone. "Outpost Echo 3 to command. Do you copy?" he said firmly, his voice breaking the silence. Static. He tried again, adjusting the frequency. "Command, this is Echo 3. Do you copy?" The static shifted, breaking for a moment. His heart jumped as he leaned in closer, but the voice that emerged wasn't what he expected. "You should leave," it whispered faintly. His stomach sank. That wasn't command. That wasn't anyone he knew. He stared at the radio, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the edge of the table. For the first time in years, genuine fear crept into his chest. "Who is this?" He barked into the receiver, his voice sharp. "Identify yourself." No response, just static, stretching endlessly. The veteran backed away from the table, his rifle now firmly in his hands. He moved to the window again, scanning the snowy expanse outside. Everything looked the same, but something felt different. The shadows in the tree line seemed deeper, darker somehow. His breath fogged up the glass as he leaned closer. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a faint blur just beyond the trees. He blinked and it was gone. "Focus," he muttered, shaking his head. Whatever was going on, he needed to stay sharp. He checked the rifle again, ensuring it was ready to fire. His mind raced with possibilities. Was it an enemy scout? Someone messing with him? Or was it something worse, something he couldn't explain? He moved back to the center of the room, his steps deliberate. Every instinct told him to prepare for the worst. The voice had said he wasn't alone, and for the first time he believed it. The silence was suffocating now, broken only by the occasional creak of the floorboards under his weight. He felt exposed, vulnerable. Whatever was out there, or in here, wasn't done yet. The wind outside grew louder, the door rattling harder against its frame. He aimed the rifle at the entrance, his finger hovering over the trigger. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the wind stopped. The stillness was deafening, amplifying the pounding of his heart in his ears. "That won't save you," the voice whispered again, this time from somewhere much closer. The veteran paced the room, rifle in hand, his eyes darting between the window and the door. The voice's words echoed in his mind. "That won't save you." The weight of those 5 words pressed on him like a heavy fog. He had faced countless threats in his time, human enemies, harsh environments, and even his own fears. But this was different. This felt wrong. Stepping to the window again, he scanned the snowy expanse outside. The tree line in the distance was still and silent, its darkness an unspoken threat. He squinted, trying to catch any movement, but the snow-covered landscape offered no answers. His breath fogged up the glass as he muttered to himself, "Just the wind, just the damn wind." But as he turned away, something outside caught his eye, a disturbance in the snow near the perimeter of the outpost. Narrowing his eyes, he grabbed his binoculars from the table and focused on the spot. Tracks. Fresh tracks. The kind that hadn't been there earlier. The prints were strange. They started as what seemed like boot marks, but halfway through they changed, elongating and spreading like claws had replaced toes. He lowered the binoculars, a chill running down his spine. His training told him to keep calm to assess the situation, but a deeper primal fear was starting to take hold. He bolted the door and moved to his supply closet, rummaging for tools. If someone or something was out there, he wasn't going to wait for it to come to him. Pulling out a roll of wire, a handful of empty cans, and a few nails, he quickly set up a rudimentary perimeter alarm. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. The hours dragged on. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the snow. The veteran sat at the table, rifle across his lap, listening intently. The wind had died down again, leaving the world eerily silent. A faint clinking sound shattered the stillness. He froze, his grip tightening on the rifle. One of the cans had been disturbed. Slowly he rose, keeping his movements deliberate and quiet. He moved to the window, crouching low, and peered out. The tracks near the perimeter were no longer just footprints. They had widened, deep grooves cutting into the snow. Something was circling his outpost. His breathing grew shallow as he moved to the door, his rifle aimed and ready. He unlocked it carefully, easing it open just enough to see outside. The cold air bit at his face, but he ignored it, his focus entirely on the strange marks in the snow. "Show yourself," he muttered under his breath, his finger hovering over the trigger. The tree line remained still, the shadows deepening as the last light of day faded. Just as he was about to shut the door, he caught movement in the corner of his eye. A flash of black against the white snow. He swung his rifle in the direction of the movement, but it was already gone. Then he heard it. A faint whisper, carried on the wind, so close it made his skin crawl. "You're not alone." His heart pounded as he slammed the door shut, bolting it with every lock he had. The voice was no longer just in his head. It was here outside, circling like a predator waiting for its prey. He moved back to the window, scanning the tree line with his scope, but the forest offered no answers. The perimeter alarm went off again, this time closer. The cans rattled violently, then stopped. The silence that followed was unbearable. He moved to the center of the room, his back to the wall, every muscle in his body tense. If something came through that door or window, he would be ready. Minutes felt like hours as he stood there, rifle aimed, waiting for the next sound. The quiet was shattered by a loud bang against the door. The veteran nearly fired, but he held his ground, his breathing controlled despite the adrenaline coursing through him. Another bang followed, harder this time, and then silence. He waited, his finger brushing the trigger. When nothing happened, he crept toward the door, his rifle raised. He leaned against the wall beside it, listening. The faint sound of scratching came from the other side, like claws dragging across the wood. Gathering his nerve, he yanked the door open and swung his rifle forward. The night air rushed in, icy and biting, but the space beyond the door was empty. No tracks, no signs of disturbance, just the cold, unbroken snow. His chest tightened as he stepped back inside, bolting the door once more. The scratching had sounded so real, yet there was no evidence of it. The voice, the tracks, the noises, they were toying with him. As he moved back to his position by the wall, the radio crackled to life. He froze, staring at it as static filled the room. Slowly he approached, his hand hovering over the knob. "Echo 3 to command," he said cautiously, his voice low. "Do you read me?" For a moment, the static continued. Then faintly, a voice emerged. "Leave." The veteran sat at the edge of his bunk, the rifle resting across his lap. The voice from the radio still echoed in his mind. It hadn't been static or a glitch. Someone, or something, had spoken to him. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, like unseen eyes were locked onto him from the shadows outside. The outpost, once a place of solitude and routine, now felt like a trap. Standing up, he moved to the window, scanning the tree line with his binoculars. The darkness had settled in fully, but the moonlight cast faint, shifting shadows across the snow. He focused on the spot where he had seen the strange tracks earlier. They were gone. Not covered by snow, just gone as if they had never been there. His stomach tightened. He knew better than to dismiss it as his imagination. Something was out there, and it wasn't playing by the rules of the natural world. Suddenly, a flash of movement caught his attention. Something darted between the trees, too fast to get a good look at. He adjusted his binoculars, his pulse quickening. "Come on," he muttered, scanning the area. There, a figure just at the edge of the tree line. It stood still, almost blending into the shadows, but its outline was unmistakable. It was tall, unnaturally so, and its limbs seemed elongated, like a grotesque caricature of a human. He gripped his rifle tightly, his breathing shallow. As he watched, the figure tilted its head, almost as if it knew he was watching. Then, without warning, it moved, swift and silent, vanishing into the forest. The veteran cursed under his breath, stepping away from the window. Whatever was out there, it was getting bolder. He needed to act before it closed in on him. The veteran barely slept that night. Every creak of the wooden floorboards, every whisper of wind against the outpost walls felt like a prelude to an ambush. He sat near the door, rifle resting across his knees, his eyes darting between the entrance and the darkened window. His training taught him patience, but this waiting, this unseen threat, was testing the limits of his resolve. It was just before dawn when it happened. A metallic clink shattered the stillness. One of the makeshift perimeter alarms had been triggered. The sound wasn't distant. It was close, right outside the door. The veteran bolted upright, his rifle already aimed. He took a slow, steady breath and moved toward the window, keeping his steps silent. He peeked outside. The faint pre-dawn light revealed disturbed snow near the perimeter. The cans on the far side of the outpost had been knocked over. Tracks crisscrossed the snow, but they weren't like before. These were deeper, more erratic, as if whoever or whatever had made them was dragging something heavy. A sudden knock at the door jolted him, followed by another, louder and more deliberate. His heart pounded as he swung his rifle toward the entrance. The knocks came again, 3 times in quick succession. It was deliberate, too deliberate. "Who's there?" He called out, his voice steady but firm. No response. He crept toward the door, careful to stay out of direct line of sight from any cracks or openings. The knock stopped, replaced by a low, scraping sound. It was faint at first, but it grew louder. A slow, deliberate scratching against the wood, like claws testing the strength of the barrier. "Identify yourself," he shouted, his finger tightening on the trigger. Still nothing. The veteran steadied his breathing and unlatched the door in one swift motion. He kicked it open, stepping back and raising his rifle. The cold air rushed in, but the space beyond the door was empty. The snow outside was disturbed, claw-like tracks leading away from the outpost. But there was no one there. He scanned the tree line, his scope tracing every shadow, every movement, but the forest was still. Just as he was about to shut the door, a shape burst from the side. It moved fast, too fast to aim. The veteran dove back into the room as a shadowy figure lunged through the open doorway. It crashed into the table, scattering supplies and flipping the chair. He rolled to his feet, his rifle already aimed. The figure stood, its form barely humanoid, cloaked in shadows that seemed to ripple and shift unnaturally. Its limbs were elongated, its hands ending in sharp, claw-like tips. The veteran didn't hesitate. He fired. The first shot hit the figure square in the chest, and it staggered back, but it didn't fall. It let out a guttural, inhuman growl before rushing toward him again. He fired 2 more rounds, each one hitting its mark. This time, the figure crumpled to the ground, twitching before going still. He approached cautiously, his rifle aimed at the motionless form. The shadows around it began to dissipate, revealing a grotesque, distorted face. It was almost human, but its features were warped, stretched in unnatural ways. He stared at it, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. Then, without warning, the body began to disintegrate. It crumbled into ash, carried away by an unseen wind. Within moments, there was nothing left but a faint scorch mark on the wooden floor. The veteran stood there, his breath heavy, his rifle still trained on the spot where the figure had fallen. He didn't understand what he had just fought, but one thing was clear: this wasn't over. He bolted the door and reinforced it with whatever he could find: furniture, crates, anything to create a barrier. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the outpost felt less like a haven and more like a trap. Whatever was out there wasn't done with him yet. The morning brought no comfort. The veteran spent hours fortifying the outpost, his hands working methodically as his mind replayed the events of the night. He had fought enemies before, but this was something else. The creature's distorted features and unnatural speed defied explanation, and the way it had dissolved into ash haunted him. He reinforced the windows, nailing planks across them to block out the view of the forest. He set up more alarms around the perimeter, using anything he could find: empty cans, spare wire, even shards of glass. His traps were simple but effective, designed to slow down anything that tried to breach the outpost. As he worked, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The tree line, just visible through the gaps in the planks, seemed darker than before. The shadows moved with the wind, but there was something unnatural about them, like they were alive. His supplies were running low. The food and water he had left wouldn't last more than a few days. He needed to call for extraction, but every attempt to contact command had been met with static, or worse, that chilling voice. He tried again, his voice steady despite the growing tension. Echo 3 to command. Do you copy? Static. He adjusted the frequency, trying again. Command, this is Echo 3. Situation critical. Request immediate extraction. For a moment, there was nothing but the hum of static. Then, faintly, the voice returned. You're wasting time. He slammed the radio down, frustration boiling over. Whoever or whatever was behind this was playing games, and he wasn't in the mood to lose. He grabbed his rifle and double-checked his ammunition. He had enough for a prolonged fight, but not enough for a siege. By mid-afternoon, the traps were set, and the outpost was as secure as he could make it. He sat at the table, cleaning his rifle once again. It was a ritual that kept him focused, a small piece of normalcy in an otherwise chaotic situation. The day passed slowly, the silence outside growing heavier as the sun dipped lower in the sky. He moved to the window, peering through the small gap he had left uncovered. The tracks from the night before had been erased, as if the snow itself had swallowed them. Then, just as the last light of day faded, he saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the tree line, its silhouette barely visible in the dim light. It didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there watching. The veteran raised his rifle, peering through the scope. The figure's features were shrouded in shadow, but its shape was unmistakable. It was one of them. As he watched, the figure tilted its head as if acknowledging him. Then slowly it raised one clawed hand and pointed directly at the outpost. The veteran's pulse quickened. He lowered the rifle, backing away from the window. Whatever was coming, it was coming tonight. The veteran stood by the window, his breath shallow as he stared into the deepening darkness. The figure at the tree line had vanished, melting into the shadows of the forest. But its presence lingered, a silent threat that gnawed at his nerves. He tightened his grip on the rifle and moved toward the door, his boots crunching softly against the wooden floor. This wasn't a situation where waiting would work. Whatever these things were, they were testing him, probing his defenses. If he didn't act, they'd grow bolder. He threw on his jacket, adjusted his gear, and slung his rifle across his back. With a deep breath, he unbolted the door and stepped into the cold night. The snow crunched under his boots as he scanned the perimeter. The moonlight cast long, distorted shadows that seemed to twist and shift with the wind. He crouched by one of his perimeter alarms, noting the tracks in the snow. They were fresh, leading toward the forest. "Here we go," he muttered, rising to his feet. He followed the tracks cautiously, his senses heightened. Every sound, the rustle of branches, the distant howl of the wind, set his nerves on edge. The tracks were erratic, weaving between trees and doubling back on themselves, as if the creature was trying to confuse him. Suddenly, a sharp snap echoed through the trees. He froze, raising his rifle. The sound had come from up ahead, where the tracks disappeared into a dense thicket. He adjusted his scope and peered into the shadows, but the forest was still. Then, a faint movement. Something darted between the trees, too quick to follow. He swung his rifle, tracking the motion, but it vanished before he could fire. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, advancing slowly. The tracks reappeared on the other side of the thicket, leading deeper into the woods. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts warning him against going further. But the thought of leaving these creatures unchecked spurred him on. The deeper he went, the stranger the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around him, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. The air grew colder and a faint, almost imperceptible hum filled the silence. It wasn't a sound he could place. It felt more like a vibration, an unsettling energy that seemed to emanate from the shadows. As he rounded a large tree, he came to an abrupt stop. In front of him was a clearing, and in the center stood an abandoned campsite. Torn tents, rusted gear, and scattered supplies littered the area. The snow here was stained dark, as if something had soaked into it and frozen over. He stepped into the clearing, his rifle raised. The campsite was eerily quiet, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. He knelt by a torn sleeping bag, examining the area. It looked like the camp had been abandoned in a hurry. Personal items, a broken compass, a knife, a half-buried journal, were strewn across the ground. Picking up the journal, he flipped through its damp, crumbling pages. The writing was nearly illegible, but a few words stood out. Shadows, trapped, run. A sudden rustling snapped him out of his focus. He spun around, his rifle aimed at the source of the sound. The forest was alive with movement now, the shadows shifting and swirling. He fired a warning shot into the air, the crack echoing through the trees. For a moment, everything went still. Then a guttural growl rumbled from the darkness. The veteran stepped back, his rifle trained on the tree line. The growl grew louder, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. Whatever was out there wasn't hiding anymore. He steadied his aim, his breath slow and controlled. A shape burst from the shadows, moving with unnatural speed. He fired, the shot hitting its mark. The creature stumbled but didn't fall, charging at him with terrifying determination. He fired again, this time aiming for its head. The creature let out a pained screech before collapsing into the snow. Before he could catch his breath, more shapes emerged from the forest. 3, 4, maybe more. They moved in unison, their distorted forms barely visible in the moonlight. The veteran turned and ran, his boots pounding against the frozen ground. The creatures gave chase, their growls echoing through the trees. He zigzagged between the trunks, using the terrain to slow them down. His breath came in short gasps, the cold air burning his lungs. He could hear them closing in, their heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. Finally, he spotted a ridge up ahead. He scrambled up the slope, slipping on the icy surface, but managing to pull himself up. Turning around, he dropped to one knee and fired into the pursuing figures. One fell, then another, but the rest kept coming. He grabbed a grenade from his belt, pulled the pin, and hurled it down the slope. The explosion lit up the night, the shockwave knocking him back. When the smoke cleared, the forest was silent once more. The veteran didn't wait to see if any had survived. He turned and made his way back to the outpost, his legs trembling with exhaustion. As he approached the building, he glanced over his shoulder. The tree line was empty, but he knew they were still out there watching. The veteran barely had time to recover before the next attack came. He was in the middle of reinforcing the outpost's windows when he heard it. A low, guttural growl followed by the sound of something heavy slamming against the door. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the center of the room, his eyes fixed on the entrance. The door shuddered under the force of another blow, the wooden frame cracking slightly. He aimed at the weak point, his finger steady on the trigger. The next hit splintered the door, and a clawed hand reached through the gap, tearing at the wood. The veteran fired, the shot ripping through the limb. The creature howled but didn't retreat. Instead, it doubled its efforts, bashing the door with renewed ferocity. He backed away, firing again as the door finally gave way. The creature burst through, its distorted form illuminated by the flickering light overhead. It moved with terrifying speed, its claws slashing at the air as it charged. The veteran fired 3 quick shots, each one hitting its target. The creature staggered but kept coming. He grabbed a chair and hurled it at the beast, buying himself enough time to reload. With a final shot to the head, the creature collapsed in a heap, its body convulsing before turning to ash. Before he could catch his breath, another figure appeared at the window, smashing through the planks. Then another. The outpost was under siege. The veteran moved with precision, firing at the intruders and using his traps to slow them down. One stepped onto a pressure plate, triggering an explosion that tore it apart. Another got tangled in wire, its distorted limbs thrashing as it tried to break free. Despite his efforts, the numbers were overwhelming. He retreated to the storage room, barricading the door behind him. He could hear them outside, their claws scratching at the walls, their growls filling the air. Reaching for his radio, he tried one last time. Echo 3 to command. I need backup. Do you read? Static. Then faintly, you're not ready. The veteran clenched his jaw, gripping his rifle tightly. He was alone in this fight, but he wasn't going down without a fight. He checked his ammunition, steeled his nerves, and prepared for the next wave. The outpost might not hold, but he would. The aftermath of the ambush left the outpost in ruins. The veteran stood in the middle of the wreckage, his breath heavy, surveying the damage. Broken furniture and scattered supplies littered the floor, while scorch marks from explosives blackened the walls. The scent of gunpowder and burnt wood hung thick in the air. He knew this wasn't over. Whatever those creatures were, they would be back, and in greater numbers. He moved cautiously through the outpost, rifle at the ready, checking for any remaining threats. The floor creaked under his boots as he approached the lifeless remains of one of the creatures. Unlike the others, this one hadn't turned to ash. Its body was intact, sprawled across the floor, its grotesque form frozen in death. The veteran knelt beside it, examining the distorted features. Its skin was pale and stretched, its eyes sunken and lifeless. Clawed hands extended unnaturally from elongated arms, and its jaw was too wide, filled with jagged, uneven teeth. It was almost human, but not quite. There was something deeply unnatural about it, something that sent a chill through him. His eyes caught something glinting on its chest. Pushing aside the tattered remnants of its clothing, he found a metal tag. It was battered and partially melted, but the engraving was still visible. His stomach twisted as he read the name. It was a tag from his unit, a name he recognized. This creature had once been a soldier, one of his own. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. These things weren't just random monsters. They were connected to his past, to missions he had buried deep in his memory. He clenched his fists, anger and guilt mixing into a volatile storm inside him. Before he could dwell on it, a faint noise pulled him back to the present. A whisper, barely audible, seemed to emanate from the body. He leaned closer, his ears straining to catch the words. "Why did you leave us?" The voice was faint, warped, and filled with pain. The veteran recoiled, his rifle instinctively aimed at the body. But the whisper was gone, leaving only silence in its wake. His grip tightened on the weapon as he rose to his feet. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just a battle for survival. It was personal. The outpost was no longer safe. He needed answers, and staying here wouldn't provide them. Gathering what little gear he had left, he prepared to head out. His supplies were dangerously low, just enough for a day or two. But he had no choice. He had to find the source of this nightmare. As he stepped outside, the cold night air bit at his face. The forest loomed ahead, its shadows deep and impenetrable. The tracks from the ambush led back into the woods, the same direction as the figure he had seen earlier. Tightening his grip on his rifle, he followed the trail, his senses on high alert. The deeper he went, the stranger the forest became. The trees seemed to close in around him, their branches twisting unnaturally. The air grew colder, and an eerie silence replaced the usual sounds of the wilderness. It felt like the forest itself was alive, watching his every move. He came across a clearing, and in the center stood a structure he hadn't seen before. A crumbling, abandoned bunker. Its concrete walls were cracked and overgrown with vines, and the faint glow of a fire flickered from within. He approached cautiously, his rifle raised, every step deliberate and silent. As he neared the entrance, he heard voices, low and guttural, speaking in a language he didn't recognize. He pressed himself against the wall, peering inside. Several figures were gathered around the fire, their distorted forms illuminated by the flames. They were like the creatures he had fought, but more humanoid, their features less warped. One of them stepped forward, holding an object in its clawed hand. It was a photograph, burned and faded, but he recognized it instantly. It was from his unit, a group photo taken before their last mission. His face was among the others, smiling and unaware of what was to come. The creature's voice broke the silence, guttural and filled with venom. "You left us. You let us die." The veteran's chest tightened as he gripped his rifle. These weren't just creatures. They were the ghosts of his past, twisted by whatever force had taken hold of them. And they wanted revenge. The veteran retreated into the shadows, his mind racing. The creatures in the bunker weren't just hunting him. They were accusing him, forcing him to confront memories he had tried to bury. He took a deep breath, steadying his nerves. He couldn't afford to hesitate. If he didn't act, they would come for him, and he wouldn't survive another ambush. He moved to higher ground, finding a ridge overlooking the bunker. From here he had a clear line of sight on the entrance. He set up a defensive position, laying down traps and marking escape routes. His hands worked quickly, his mind focused on the task at hand. There was no room for doubt now. As the hours passed, the night grew colder. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees whispering secrets he couldn't understand. He watched the bunker carefully, his rifle trained on the entrance. The creatures inside moved occasionally, their shadows flickering against the walls. They seemed to be waiting for something, though he couldn't tell what. Then, without warning, the fire inside the bunker went out. The darkness swallowed the interior, and the figures disappeared from view. The veteran tensed, his finger brushing the trigger. He scanned the area, his eyes darting between the trees, searching for movement. A sudden noise to his left made him turn. One of the traps had been triggered. He swung his rifle around, aiming at the disturbance. A figure emerged from the shadows, moving with terrifying speed. He fired, the shot hitting its mark, but two more appeared behind it. The forest erupted into chaos. The creatures charged at him from all sides, their guttural growls filling the air. He fired in controlled bursts, each shot finding its target, but they kept coming. He retreated toward his escape route, his boots slipping on the icy ground. One of the creatures lunged at him, its claws raking across his arm. He gritted his teeth against the pain and drove his knife into its chest. It let out a piercing screech before collapsing, its body dissolving into ash. He reached a narrow ravine, using it as a natural choke point. The creatures followed, their distorted forms illuminated by the faint moonlight. He detonated one of his traps, the explosion tearing through the group and sending fragments of snow and debris into the air. But it wasn't enough. More shadows emerged from the forest, their numbers seemingly endless. His ammunition was running low, and exhaustion was taking its toll. He couldn't keep this up. As the last of his traps detonated, he spotted a faint light in the distance. It was weak, barely visible through the trees, but it was something. Summoning his last reserves of strength, he made a break for it, the creatures hot on his heels. The light grew brighter as he approached, revealing an ancient stone altar surrounded by strange, glowing symbols. The air around it pulsed with energy, making his skin prickle. He didn't know what it was, but he had no other choice. He turned to face the creatures, his back against the altar. With his rifle nearly empty and his knife ready, he prepared for one final stand. The veteran pressed his back against the ancient altar, his breath ragged and his body trembling with exhaustion. The faint glow of the strange symbols carved into the stone provided the only light, casting an eerie hue across the clearing. The creatures closed in, their distorted forms barely visible in the darkness. Their guttural growls sent chills down his spine. He checked his rifle, 3 rounds left. His knife felt small and useless in his other hand. He had faced impossible odds before, but this was different. This wasn't just survival. It was personal. The weight of his past and the truth about these creatures hung heavy over him, fueling his resolve. The first creature lunged from the shadows. He fired, the bullet finding its mark and sending the beast sprawling to the ground. It screeched as it dissolved into ash, but 2 more took its place. He fired again, hitting one, but the other was too fast. It closed the distance, its claws slashing through the air. The veteran sidestepped the attack, driving his knife into the creature's side. It howled, twisting violently as it fell. But before he could recover, another slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. His rifle skidded out of reach as the beast's claws raked across his chest, tearing through his jacket. He gritted his teeth, grabbing its arm and twisting hard. The creature let out a guttural scream before he plunged his knife into its throat. He rolled to his feet, blood dripping from his wounds, and retrieved his rifle. Only 1 round left. The remaining creatures circled him, their glowing eyes locked onto him with predatory focus. He knew he couldn't fight them all. He needed to buy time to figure out what the altar's strange energy could do. As they moved closer, he took a step back, placing his hand on the cold stone. The glow beneath his palm pulsed, and the air around him seemed to hum with power. The creatures hesitated, their growls faltering as they eyed the altar warily. "Come on," he muttered, his voice a mix of defiance and desperation. "What are you waiting for?" One of them charged, and instinctively he pressed harder against the symbols. A burst of light erupted from the altar, blinding both him and the approaching creature. The beast let out an agonized wail, its body disintegrating mid-charge. The others recoiled, their forms flickering as if unstable. The veteran stared at the glowing stone, his heart racing. Whatever this was, it was their weakness. He grabbed a small rock and began smashing the glowing symbols, each strike causing another burst of energy. The creatures howled in agony, their distorted forms fading into the shadows. But as the last of them disappeared, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the forest. The ground beneath him trembled, and the air grew colder. From the darkness, a massive figure emerged. It was larger than the others, its form more defined but still grotesque. Its glowing red eyes locked onto him, radiating hatred. This wasn't just another creature. This was their leader. The veteran gripped his rifle tightly, knowing he was outmatched. The leader's towering figure exuded an aura of menace, and its every step seemed to shake the ground. It stopped a few paces from the altar, its clawed hands flexing as it tilted its head, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. "You," it rumbled, its voice deep and guttural. "You left us to die." The veteran's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he aimed his rifle. "I don't know what you are, but you're not my men." The leader's distorted face twisted into something resembling a grin. "No. Do you even remember their faces, their screams?" Memories flooded back. His last mission with the unit, the ambush that had gone wrong. He had given the order to retreat, leaving some of his men behind. It was a choice he had made to save the rest, but it had haunted him ever since. "I did what I had to do," he said, his voice low but firm. "It wasn't my choice." The leader snarled, taking a step closer. "You abandoned us, and now you'll pay." The creature lunged, faster than anything its size should have been. The veteran fired his last round, the bullet striking its shoulder and staggering it for only a moment. He grabbed his knife, dodging its claws as they swiped inches from his face. The fight was brutal and desperate. The veteran struck with precision, but the creature's sheer strength was overwhelming. It knocked him to the ground, its claws digging into his shoulder as it pinned him down. "Look at me," the leader roared, its face inches from his. "Do you see what you've done?" The veteran gritted his teeth, pain shooting through his body as he struggled against its grip. His hand searched the ground blindly, finding a sharp fragment of stone. With all his strength, he drove it into the creature's neck. The leader howled, releasing him as it staggered back. The veteran scrambled to his feet, clutching his bleeding shoulder. The altar's glow caught his eye, its symbols flickering weakly. He realized the stone still held power, enough to end this. The creature charged again, and he sidestepped at the last second, leading it toward the altar. As it turned to face him, He placed his hand on the stone, pouring every ounce of his will into it. The symbols flared brightly, and a shockwave of light erupted from the altar, engulfing the leader. The creature let out an ear-splitting roar as its body began to disintegrate. "This isn't over," it bellowed, its form collapsing into ash. The light from the altar faded, leaving the clearing in silence. The veteran sank to his knees, his body trembling from exhaustion and pain. The battle was over, but the weight of what had happened pressed heavily on him. He had faced his past, confronted his mistakes, and survived. But he knew this wasn't the end. There were more questions than answers, and the fight wasn't truly over. As dawn broke over the horizon, he stood, gripping his rifle tightly. The forest was still, the air heavy with the lingering tension of the night. He turned toward the distant outline of the outpost, ready to face whatever came next. The veteran slumped against the cold, splintered wall of the outpost, his body battered and his mind racing. The glowing symbols on the altar and their sudden extinguishing had changed everything. He had destroyed the leader, but the forest still felt alive, its silence unnerving. He clutched the journal tighter, rereading the cryptic words, "The curse cannot be broken, only passed on." Exhaustion gnawed at him, but he forced himself to act. He knew staying idle meant death, or worse. The strange scorch marks on the floor, radiating from the altar's destruction, looked eerily similar to the containment symbols he had seen in the journal. Whatever force the symbols had restrained was loose now, and he was ground zero. He dragged himself to the supply room, searching for anything useful. Ammunition was nearly gone. His traps were spent. The outpost was little more than a battered shell, but he refused to give in. He worked methodically, drawing the containment symbols from the journal onto the walls and floors using charcoal and blood. Each stroke was deliberate, his hand steady despite the tremors coursing through him. As the hours ticked by, the air inside the outpost grew heavier. The dim daylight filtering through the boarded windows gave way to an unnatural twilight, casting long, distorted shadows. Every creak of the wood beneath his boots felt amplified, every gust of wind against the walls like a whispered warning. Then it came, the first sign. A low rumble reverberated through the ground, faint but unmistakable. The veteran froze, his hand tightening on his knife. The rumble grew louder, followed by a series of guttural growls that seemed to echo from all directions. He moved to the window, rifle raised, and peered through a gap in the planks. At first, there was nothing, just the stillness of the snow-covered forest. Then movement. Shadows darted between the trees, faster than his eyes could track. The growls intensified, joined by the sound of heavy footsteps crunching through the snow. The creatures were coming. The veteran took position near the center of the outpost, his back to the wall. The glowing symbols on the floor offered a faint sense of protection, but he knew it wouldn't last. He checked his rifle. A single magazine remained. His knife lay at his side, sharp and ready. The first attack came suddenly. A clawed hand smashed through one of the boarded windows, raking through the wood. The veteran fired, the shot blowing apart the limb. The creature shrieked and retreated, but another one burst through the weakened door, its distorted form illuminated by the flickering glow of the symbols. He fired again, the bullet striking the creature's head. It crumpled to the ground, its body dissolving into ash. But the victory was short-lived. More creatures swarmed the outpost, smashing through windows and tearing at the walls. Their growls filled the air, blending into a cacophony of chaos. The veteran moved with practiced precision, his every shot calculated. He fired, reloaded, and fought hand-to-hand when necessary, his knife slashing through the distorted forms. The floor was soon slick with his own blood and the ash of his enemies. But no matter how many he killed, more kept coming. The symbols on the floor began to flicker, their glow fading with each passing moment. He realized the containment wasn't holding. The force that fueled the creatures was overwhelming the makeshift defenses. As the last round left his rifle, he grabbed a broken piece of wood from the shattered table and used it as an improvised weapon. His strikes were fierce but desperate, each blow driven by pure survival instinct. His muscles burned, his vision blurred, but he refused to fall. Hours felt like minutes, and soon the onslaught slowed. The veteran stood amidst the wreckage, his body trembling. The last creature fell, its body collapsing into ash as the others had. The room fell silent, save for the sound of his labored breathing. He stumbled toward the altar, the flickering glow of the remaining symbols catching his eye. The journal's words haunted him. Sacrifice must be made. The curse must have a host. He understood now. The outpost wasn't just a prison. It was a beacon, a lure for whatever malevolent force had corrupted the forest. And unless he did something, the cycle would continue. As he knelt by the altar, a faint voice whispered through the room, low and sinister. "You cannot leave," it said. "You belong to us now." The veteran gritted his teeth, his fists clenched. "Not yet," he muttered, his voice hoarse. He reached for the journal, flipping to the final pages. The instructions were cryptic, but he pieced them together. The containment could be restored, but it required a willing host to anchor the curse. Without one, the force would remain unleashed, spreading its corruption to anyone who came near. He sat there, staring at the flickering symbols. The choice was clear: leave and let the curse destroy others, or stay and take the burden upon himself. The veteran sat in silence, the journal resting in his lap. The voices had grown louder, their whispers circling him like a predatory wind. The glow of the containment symbols was almost gone, and the darkness in the room felt alive, pressing in on him. He thought of the men he had left behind, of the decisions he had made during the war. The faces of his fallen comrades flashed before his eyes, their voices merging with the whispers in the room. "You left us," they said. "You let us die." He clenched his fists, his breath shallow. "I didn't have a choice," he muttered. But the words rang hollow. He had told himself that for years, but now faced with the consequences of his actions, he wasn't so sure. The altar pulsed faintly, its energy waning. The journal's final passage echoed in his mind. "Once you're bound, there's no escape." He knew what he had to do. The curse needed a host, someone to contain its power and keep it from spreading. If he didn't act, the outpost would become a gateway, unleashing the darkness on the world beyond. Rising to his feet, he placed the journal on the altar and picked up his rifle one last time. He walked to the center of the room, standing within the fading glow of the symbols. The whispers grew louder, their words clearer now. They weren't accusing anymore, they were inviting. "Take your place," they said. "End this." The veteran closed his eyes, his body trembling. The weight of his choices pressed down on him, but he refused to falter. He placed his hands on the altar, the cold stone pulsing beneath his palms. The energy surged through him, filling him with a strange, overwhelming warmth. The whispers turned into a roar, and the room was bathed in blinding light. He felt the curse take hold, its dark tendrils wrapping around his mind and body. His memories blurred, his past fading into the void. He was no longer himself. He was the outpost's guardian, its new anchor. When the light faded, the outpost was silent. The veteran stood in the center of the room, his eyes glowing faintly with the same energy that had once illuminated the symbols. The walls were whole again, the marks repaired the curse contained. The forest was stilled, its unnatural presence subdued. The outpost had been restored, its prison sealed. But the veteran remained, his soul bound to the place, his existence a solitary vigil to ensure no one else suffered the same fate. The voices quieted, replaced by an eerie calm. He was alone now, but he had found his purpose. He had ended the cycle, at a price. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the outpost stood silent, its guardian watching from within. The outpost stood silent under the gray light of dawn, its walls scarred but intact. The battle was over, and the forest seemed to have fallen into a deep, uneasy stillness. But the veteran wasn't at peace. He had made the ultimate choice, binding himself to be outpost to contain the curse. Yet a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that it might not be over. He sat at the edge of his cot, rifle resting across his knees. His body bore fresh scars, his hands trembling slightly as the weight of the curse began to settle. The whispers were gone, but he could feel the energy coursing through him, a constant hum that never let him forget what he had become. The journal sat on the table beside him, its pages open to the last entry. The words blurred in his mind, repeated endlessly. "Once you're bound, there's no escape." He had accepted his fate, but something about the stillness outside felt wrong. The radio crackled to life, breaking the heavy silence. Static hissed for a moment, then a faint voice came through. "Echo 3, this is command. Do you copy?" The veteran's heart skipped a beat. It had been days, weeks maybe, since he heard a real human voice. He grabbed the receiver. his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "This is Echo 3. I read you." "Hold position," the voice replied. "Extraction is en route. ETA 15 minutes. He placed the receiver down, his mind racing. Extraction. After everything that had happened, the idea of leaving seemed impossible. The curse had anchored him here, and he knew the forest wouldn't let him go. But Command didn't know that. They thought he was just another soldier at an isolated post. The minutes ticked by, each one heavier than the last. He stepped outside, scanning the tree line for any signs of movement. The forest remained quiet, the snow unbroken. For the first time in weeks, he felt something like hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could leave. The faint hum of rotor blades reached his ears, growing louder with each passing second. He turned his eyes to the sky, spotting the helicopter in the distance. It approached cautiously, circling the outpost once before hovering above the clearing. A rope ladder descended, swaying gently in the breeze. "Echo 3. The pilot's voice came through a loudspeaker. "We're here to extract. Move to the ladder." The veteran hesitated, his hands tightening around his rifle. His instincts screamed at him to stay, to resist the temptation. But a deeper, more human part of him pushed him forward. He walked toward the ladder, each step heavier than the last. The curse pulled at him, its grip tightening with every movement. As he reached the base of the ladder, he paused, his hand brushing against the first rung. The hum inside him grew louder, almost deafening. The forest seemed to react, the shadows deepening and shifting. He glanced over at his shoulder, the tree line darker than before. Then he heard it, a faint whisper, almost pleading, "Don't leave." The veteran froze, his breath catching in his throat. The forest felt alive again, its presence pressing down on him like a heavy weight. He looked back at the helicopter, its blades slicing through the air, a symbol of freedom that now felt out of reach. Chapter 15. The Guardian's Watch. The whispers grew louder, their tone no longer pleading but demanding. "You cannot leave," they said, echoing in his mind. The veteran gritted his teeth, his hand tightening on the ladder. He wanted to leave, to escape this cursed place and the memories that haunted him. But deep down he knew the truth. The curse wouldn't let him go. He stepped back, his boots crunching in the snow, and turned to face the forest. The shadows writhed as if acknowledging his decision. The helicopter hovered above, the pilot's voice cutting through the tension. "Echo 3, what's your status? Move to the ladder now." The veteran raised his radio, his voice calm despite the storm inside him. "I can't leave." "What do you mean?" The pilot replied, urgency creeping into his tone. "You're clear for extraction. Get on the ladder, soldier." The veteran lowered the radio, his gaze fixed on the tree line. The shadows seemed to part, revealing faint, flickering shapes, distorted figures that looked almost human. They stood silently, watching him. He could feel their eyes on him, their presence overwhelming. He took a deep breath, the weight of his decision settling over him. The curse demanded a guardian, someone to maintain the fragile balance and keep the darkness contained. If he left, the outpost would fall, and the curse would spread. He had seen what it could do, how it twisted men into monsters. He couldn't let that happen. Turning back to the helicopter, he raised his hand in a silent gesture. The pilot hesitated, then gave a brief nod. The ladder retracted, and the helicopter began to ascend. The sound of the rotors faded into the distance, leaving the veteran alone once more. The day passed in eerie silence. The forest remained still, its shadows deep but unmoving. The veteran returned to the outpost, his every step heavy with the weight of his choice. Inside, he sat at the table, staring at the journal. Its pages seemed to taunt him, a reminder of the life he had given up. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, something shifted. The symbols he had drawn on the walls began to glow faintly, their light steady and strong. The air inside the outpost felt lighter, the oppressive presence of the curse receding slightly. He realized that by accepting his role as the guardian, he had stabilized the containment. The curse was still there, but it was no longer trying to escape. He stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the darkened forest. The shadows no longer writhed with malice. They seemed subdued, almost respectful. The veteran knew he was no longer just a man. He was part of the outpost now, its protector and prisoner. The whispers returned, softer this time, like a distant echo. They weren't angry or accusing anymore. They were calm, almost grateful. "Thank you," they said. The veteran nodded silently, his grip tightening on his rifle. The fight wasn't over, he knew that. The curse would test him again, and the darkness would always be there, waiting for a moment of weakness. But he was ready. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the veteran stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the faint glow of the symbols. The outpost was quiet, its secrets contained for now, and he would be there, watching, waiting, ensuring the darkness stayed where it belonged. He had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The Guardian's watch had begun.